All right, and we are live for our 15th episode of Screw Loose, and this is our Step Up and Intermediate Flute Special Edition. So one of the most frequently asked questions that I get as a flute technician and a flute teacher is by people who are looking for that next flute after their student flute, and they see all of the options and it's super overwhelming, and they don't want to spend a ton of money, but they know that they need something better and they don't know what to do. So if this sounds familiar to you, this is the episode for you. So we're gonna take a little tour through what is a step-up flute, what are all those options that are like, in those big lists when people are trying to sell you a flute, why you shouldn't buy an intermediate flute, why you should buy an intermediate flute, and whatever else happens to come up along the way. So we are a Screw Loose. We are Rachel Simon from Pennsylvania and Adam Petrie from Georgia, and Kim Durans from the west coast of Canada, and me, Sarah Stockton from Connecticut. And let's dive in, guys. So what is an intermediate / step up flute? Does anybody want to take that away?
To jump in first.
Go Kim, go.
I nominate Kim.
In a really wide spectrum. An intermediate flute is anything that isn't a student flute. That sounds like a dodge. Anything that has got open holes, that is from that the next step up from the entry level flute that company makes, is a step up flute. It is a step up from the basic student thing that you rent when you are going into school with closed holes, a C-foot, no options. That's it. So a step up is the next thing, and the lines between step up and intermediate are mostly just who you talk to. They're basically the same thing. There isn't this extra little step up from step up to intermediate, really. It's just a spectrum and terminology that people use depending on where they live. So that is basically an intermediate flute. Is the other big difference is that it isn't handmade. It may be made for a company that makes handmade flutes too, but it is not a handmade flute. It is still a commercially made product. Yes.
So we're talking specifically tonight about flutes, generally about $3,000 and less to around 1,000-ish. And you can, of course, I would say the handmade market starts around maybe 10,000 for the least expensive handmade flute. Would you guys agree with that?
Well, the EX and the Muramatsu EX is still a handmade flute, and so is the Muramatsu 202. So I mean,
4, 5,
5, 6,
5,
yeah,
6.
Yeah.
Okay, right. You're correct. So, and that's where it gets really murky, is in that I'd say the 3,000 to 10,000 range, because you can still get a very much intermediate step up flute, and you can get a handmade flute in that price range. So that is, those are waters that maybe we should chart in another episode.
Stay tuned for our next one, where we'll discuss the differences in that category.
Yes.
It's a really important category too, though.
It is a very important category. Okay, so tonight, though, we're going to try to stick to the 3,000 and less, but more than a beginner starter flute. Okay, great. So Kim mentioned that there are options available on these flutes that are generally not available on beginner flutes. So Rachel or Adam, do you want to walk us through what some of those options that people might see listed on websites?
I mean,
what you trade off. Adam can start,
and then example, though.
Adam
first one that people will notice, they have holes.
Usually. Usually.
You can plug the holes, though.
Usually.
Yeah.
Usually they have open hold keys, and one of the first things is you'll have a B-foot joint. Now this is my handmade flute that I'm just showing. It'll have most of them will have a low B, at least in the American market. Some of them will have a gold lip plated or solid, depending, step ups have done a lot of stuff.
For $3,000, it's going to be plated.
Yeah, the gold gets into those murky areas. Yes. So because we'll do all sorts of crazy stuff. You'll have different parts of the body that are made out of solid silver. Typically they'll start with the head joint, and then they'll move on to doing the body and the foot joint tubing. For under 3,000, you're not going to have solid silver keys. I don't think there are any step ups that are all sterling. Are there?
Nope.
I don't think so.
Nope, none.
And then
the metal itself costs more than that.
Well, is it the
Yeah.
400 Yamaha 400 series?
they're plated keys.
They're
Plated.
I
still-
believe that's
Yep.
yeah, they're
So
still
we got
plated.
Yeah,
right
and
here.
then you'll start to get options for like a C-sharp trill key, which is this extra lever here that opens this additional tone hole right there. And then you also have a splitty, which is hard to see here, but it's this bar that closes this key right there.
And what does that
You'll
do?
start to see those. What that is it helps facilitate the response of high E natural, and it corrects an acoustic issue because that tone hole technically needs to be closed for it to speak the way it should. So that's in a nutshell. Am I forgetting anything?
Rachel, you look like you had some things.
Does anybody have an inline versus offset?
Yeah, I don't
Andy?
have
Oh, I do.
online.
I do.
Oh,
actually.
Rachel can just, it becomes an option
Yes.
once you get to
Yeah.
intermediate. It's not an option that we really see anymore, but it is an option that people may be familiar with.
Yeah, especially if
So-
you're buying used, you will see
Used.
more inline options. But so for your, I wasn't planning.
We
on
can
doing it,
see
but
you.
kind of match how I can do it. But so for your left hand position, the offset G is going to bring your G keys a little further away from the rest of the left hand, which is more ergonomic for a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of folks, just because your fourth finger may be shorter, and that just fits the hand better for a lot of folks. But that said, once you get into the step up range, you tend to have the option for inline, where the G keys are in a straight line with the other left hand keys. So for some people, there's a little more of a stretch there. For some people, that's really comfortable. But that's another option that you're going to see when you're looking at these flutes. And
They're
speaking of,
special order at this point, though.
Oh, that Rachel also
Inline is a
to
special
see
order at this
something.
point.
If you look at the flute that Rachel had, you know, that like a lot of student flutes has the Y arms,
Yes.
which is the way that the key
Yeah.
is attached, and then some brands will have the pointed arms. There are differing like advantages to both, but they aren't really anything that the player needs to worry about. It just means the technician has to handle them slightly differently because if they
A
bend,
little differently.
they have different tendencies. But
Yep.
that's an aesthetic thing.
It's
usually.
mostly aesthetics. Yeah. So don't worry about
Oh,
if you find a
yeah.
flute that you love that has Y arms, it's
Yeah.
still good.
It's fine.
You'll just start to see those different shapes in the step up categories.
It's worth mentioning also that if you get all hung up on the pointed arm versus Y arms, that on open hole flutes, all of the open holes have to be Y arms.
Right.
So it's not as if you like are jumping into a, oh my gosh, I need pointed arms, like, because they're horrible. Because even on a flute with pointed arms, the open holes where you put your fingers are Y arms, because you need
I legit
space
used
for
to
your
wonder about that when I was flute shopping in high school.
Oh, that's awesome. So I think that's sometimes you'll see a G disc or a G donut mentioned, and that is sort of a different way of facilitating the high E, and it's something that you won't even notice unless you like look up underneath the keys, and you might see like the second G key is filled in a little bit, either like with a crescent or with a hole, and all that is doing is making the high E a little bit easier. Now C sharp trill, high E, D sharp rollers, low B feet, like all of this stuff is pretty much just gravy. And
they're options, not
they're
like
options. They do not make a flute better or worse, speaking mechanically. So you can spend a whole lot of money on all these options and still not get a better flute necessarily.
Yes. Because I think, I don't know if we're going to jump ahead too much a little bit, but talking about these options, getting all these options, which you would see on very, handmade flutes, it's available in a flute that's 3,000 or less. So what does that mean? That means this whole price point is about balance, because even making a mass-produced commercially made flute takes a lot of work, and it's hard. It's hard to make flutes. So if you're going to be adding features on for that price point, it does make you consider what other things didn't get as much attention sometimes.
Absolutely. So what are the reasons that someone might need to upgrade? Like why get an intermediate flute if all of this stuff is just sort of like optional, right? So in my experience, it's about the head joint cut and the quality of the head joint cut, and in the quality, the build quality of the mechanism, like how fast can those keys reliably go, and the padding. So what do you guys think?
I think the biggest step up is the head joint cut, not necessarily the head joint material. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but not necessarily, like, it can be a big jump to get solid silver, but if you actually love the cut of a head joint that is silver plated instead, you should pick that one, not just go to the silver one, solid silver one that you like, that should be better, but you actually sound better and feel better on the other flute. So I think the cut of the head joint is on intermediate flutes and step up flutes, that range tends to be more hand finished. And that's actually the big advantage, is the fact that you're going from a stock kind of a student flute head joint cut to somebody sitting there and actually like voicing it, like making sure that it's doing all the things it's supposed to.
Yep.
So.
Rachel, do you want to talk about the mechanism a little bit, like the differences between what you might get with a student model and something like that's a step above that?
Like tolerances, maybe?
Yes, the tolerances will be generally at the lower end of our price range that we're talking about. The mechanical tolerances might be quite similar to a student flute, which is also part of one's decision to upgrade, because you have to take into account, do you really need those extra features? Because otherwise it's really just an open hole student flute.
Exactly.
But towards the upper end of that price range, the tolerances do get tighter, and what that feels like to the player is you're going to have a more precise feel, and you can have more customized spring tension, for example, more precise pad seating and stability, typically. So that's something that increases generally with price, depending on the brand.
Yeah. So do we miss anything?
Well, we need to, for people that aren't aware, define what the word tolerance is. We use that all the time, but if you're not a technician, you might not be familiar with that word.
Yes,
tolerance means margin of error related to precision. So when we say higher tolerances, it means it's more precise and more accurately made. That's not to say that student flutes are inaccurately made or that they're poorly made. It's just saying that they have a little bit more wiggle room in what is acceptable to meet the price points that they need to get them out the door.
Exactly.
Well, and
sorry,
go.
Oh, okay.
No,
I was just gonna say what that translates into is that as you are progressing and you're playing faster and faster excerpts, you can play with a lighter touch and you don't have to work as hard. So this is going to be really, really good for your hand health and for your long-term technique if you move up to a more appropriate flute. If you're trying to play the Carnival of the Animals, on Aunt Susie's 50-year-old, beginner flute versus, something that's built to modern standards and is in the $3,000 price range, the difference is going to be like night and day.
You're going to really help you a lot more.
Yes. And it's going to really facilitate if you plan on going further with your flute studies. It's going to make that possible.
The other thing about tolerances is that student flutes intentionally have kind of like looser tolerances because students tend to kind of push on keys sideways and kind of torque them. And that's why some of the lower price point intermediate flutes also have the same type of mechanism, because if you're still learning how to navigate playing flute and you've done the step up, if you had very, very tight tolerances on your instrument, you could actually cause the mechanism to like bind up. If the tolerances were really tight. The other thing is that it also, when you step up to the tighter tolerances, you also are stepping up into a more committed maintenance schedule, because the oil on those flutes has to be changed more often because the tolerances are tighter. So gunk that gets in there, you're going to feel a lot more than on a student flute that you can kind of just like play. And if it gets a bit of goo in there, whatever, the tolerances will allow for it. So loose tolerances are bad on student flutes or beginning intermediate, but you do have to take them into account.
Right. And it also You can be less careful with them. Like you can literally, drop
Yeah.
a student flute on the
Those
ground
kids
and
can
pick it up
bump
and go,
into-
it's good.
They're designed to be forgiving, and
Yes.
for a reason. It's not just to cut costs, although that's part of it, but a lot of it is because of what they're intended to be used for. And
Mhm.
I have seen a lot of times where a nice step-up flute has been handled in a way that would be more consistent with what you would see on student flutes, and then the players have problems and they don't understand why, and there has to be an adjustment in the care going from one flute to another sometimes.
Absolutely. So why shouldn't somebody buy a step-up flute?
Why shouldn't they?
Why shouldn't they? Like,
When should they stick with a student one or jump to a pro?
yeah,
is really the question.
And also like, what are common mistakes that people make when shopping for an intermediate flute? Does anybody want to?
I'll take it if anybody else will, but
should I be rolling our screws? I didn't even.
Yeah. I mean, that might be helpful because it makes us answer, but also one obvious reason you shouldn't buy a step-up flute or a more expensive flute is if you leave it outside or you leave it on the roof of your car and it ends up on the side of the highway.
Or beach flute.
Or you run over with your car. If you can't take care of it, then you shouldn't throw money away.
if your life isn't such that taking care of a more expensive instrument is within your ability, sounds wrong and judgy, but that's not what I mean. If it's more than you can handle or more than your life circumstances can handle, including repair costs,
right,
it might not be a good idea to step up.
Right. Or if you're shopping for your child and you know your kid pretty well and you know that they're not ready for that level of responsibility yet, then keep them on their baby flute for a while longer.
They haven't figured out how to keep goldfish alive. Maybe don't buy them a $3,000 instrument. Although goldfish are tricky.
On mine.
Goldfish
with a banana flute.
So let's talk about common mistakes that we see people making when they are shopping for flutes. And this is where actually, I'll be honest, a lot of times I'll read some internet forums and I'll see people asking questions about, what flute should I get? And I'm looking at this flute, and I'm like, there's just no question. There's just no question, right? Which one you should be looking at, because I know as a technician which one I know, I understand which one is built better, and a lot of people, for very understandable reasons, don't have that knowledge. If you ask me about cars,
I'm asking Rachel.
Yeah, exactly. That's when I'm like, okay, Rachel knows cars. I'll ask her. But so what are some of the things that people should be looking for in their step-up flute? How do they know if they're getting one that's going to be good?
Ooh, I think you should roll the screws.
Yeah, okay. Run the screws.
Can we roll the screws? Because that actually also gives us one thing that we can talk about and then move on, so I don't monopolize.
Okay. Cool.
I could talk about this topic for 5 sessions.
Well, you're very educated to speak on this topic.
Okay. So anyway, message Kim with your question. Sorry.
Roll the screws. It'll be fine.
All right, roll the screws. All right, we've got.
You can make me laugh if you want.
It's Kim. And then Rachel. And then me. And then.
How about we have me go last? Actually, let's fudge it and just put me to the back.
All right. So Rachel, then me, then Adam, then Kim, and let me get my clock here.
All right, fudge the results a little.
Okay, so common flute shopping mistakes that we wish people knew about before they started spending money. Go.
Okay. I'm first. Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that a common mistake being made is a fixation on the materials, and I'm speaking as someone who also had that fixation when I was upgrading from my student flute. And knowing what I know now, I would have placed a much higher importance on just about everything other than whether the flute was solid silver or not, which at the time I would say that was probably the top of my pyramid, because it had to be silver. And that I would change that now if I had to do it over again.
Right on. That was exactly what I was going to say. So I'll pick something else to say. So, okay. For me, it's like I said before, like the build quality and whether the Flute company has a consistent record over a lot of years for making a well-built intermediate model flute. And not necessarily whether they have a big name or some artist has endorsed them or whether it sounds good when you first play it. Like that is not an indicator whether it sounds good when you first pick it up.
All of that.
And I actually have an article about this where I put actually recommendations that look like mine, but it's really all of us talking. And I'll put a link to that in the comments. So, all right, who's next? Adam, go.
Adam.
One word. eBay. Because eBay, like I've seen parents be like, we got them a step-up flute. It said silver, it had open holes, low B, and it's even brand named like Melody or like something like that. And it's only $300. What a great deal.
It says best flute.
Right, that is not, and it says, look, with the @ signs for O's, you know? Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that.
No, if at the very least, like you need to be talking to like at least a band director, if not like a private teacher, so they can steer you in the right direction to start learning.
Right on. Kim.
Me.
Yes, go.
I think the biggest mistake that people make when they're getting ready to shop for a step-up intermediate is thinking that they are designed to be forever flutes. And this is not the person buying it's fault, because sometimes retailers aren't very good at explaining that either. Intermediate and step-up flutes are meant to be a stepping stone. They're not designed to be played by someone for 25 years. They're meant to get you past the very student level and get you give you a step up, so you can decide whether you're going to be playing for a really long time, whether you want to buy a handmade flute, and give you the time to save up, because handmade flutes are expensive, and shop around and get the experience as a player and stuff like that. They're designed to be a stepping stone instrument. They are not designed to take you through a 20-year playing career. And that's right from the manufacturers. That's like they are meant to be a stepping stone.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually the biggest thing is that players and parents and stuff like that go, and this is going to be the last flute you buy.
Yeah.
And that puts a lot of pressure on you too.
It does. And I want to add to that, one other big mistake or big misconception, I guess, that I see a lot is I constantly see people saying, what can I get for $1,000? What can I get for less than $1,000? That's it, you can't. You cannot get an intermediate flute for less than $1,000. That's going to be good.
Or isn't going to need $1,000 worth of work.
Right, exactly. And like think of it this way. So like I'm going to, put a date on myself here. But when I in 1993, yes, in 1993, I got my open hole Gemeinhardt, and it was amazing. And it was $1,000 in 1993, people. There is such a thing as inflation.
My rent isn't what it was in 1993. Right, like, I'll tell you that much.
It's 2021. Like you're not going to get an open hole flute for $1,000. It's just that's going to be built to the same quality that was built in 1993 for $1,000. Yeah, like there hasn't been that many amazing advances in automated flute making technology that would bring the cost down that much. Like it just
automated flute making
technology. Yeah, someone still has pads in it, and that still takes the longest.
I mean, CNC machines have made some things incredible upgrades from what they were 30 years ago. Head joints are a really good example of that. because the student head joints that you get today in the most basic student flute are night and day, heads and tails, miles better than what was available 25 years ago. Because now the Magic CNC machine goes and like cuts this very like straightforward, not like hand finished, but way better than before when they used basically a cookie cutter.
Are we gonna later on in the topic, are we going to talk about advancements in this category, or should I hold off on that?
Maybe like at the end.
At the end?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me know.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
The one thing I did want to add really quickly to Adam's eBay comment is the other thing is there is a number of other online sources that I won't name so we don't get in legal trouble, but if you think you can buy Miyazawa or Muramatsu or Brandon for $300 online brand new at your favorite discount place that also sells really strange things, they are counterfeits. They're out there, unfortunately. So if you're shopping around and you're seeing the flute for $3,000 somewhere else, and then you're seeing it new on one of these websites, and it's $300, it's because it's a counterfeit. Unfortunately,
one of the great things about having the internet is that it's very easy to reach out to somebody who's knowledgeable and ask
questions.
Always ask.
Yes.
And with any step up flute, well, any flute at all, really, I always ask my client or tell my clients to feel free to bring stuff to me to check out if they're not sure before they buy it. And I'm more than happy to do that because chances are I'm going to have to work on whatever they buy. So I have a vested interest.
I want it to be nice too.
Exactly. So let's keep
You're
moving.
so selfish, Sarah.
I am. It's all about me. So let's keep moving. And so when Kim, you brought this up earlier, but when should someone skip this category entirely and move straight into getting like a handmade flute or a pre-professional flute?
Do you want me to take that, or do we want to?
Do we roll, or do we want to just have Kim answer it? I think I'm okay with you just answering it.
Yeah.
Okay. I think staying on a student flute for longer and then skipping. If you are a serious musician, even if you're a young musician, but you know this is what you want to do forever, or at least for the next 10 years, you're considering going to university, you're already say like maybe going into high school or past high school, or like just finishing high school. If you're going into university and you can find a way in your power to get an entry-level handmade flute, it's the right option. Skipping the intermediate flute at that point is going to be a much better option, and going directly into an entry-level handmade because the mechanism is going to be so much better. It's also going to be worth fixing.
Yes. And so it's
going to be more precise and stuff like that.
Right. And so that we're talking about the $4,000 to $6,000 range of like Miyazawa, Muramatsu, like handmade but plated usually. Great. It's the mechanism and the embouchure, right? People like that's the part that's important.
You're gonna need the professional parts of it.
Exactly.
Sooner. The other option, the other situation where that would be a good option is skipping the intermediate sort of flute, is if you're an adult player who's rented a flute for long enough that you know that you like flute and you're going to take it up for a couple of years, and you do have the facility economically to just buy something because you know you're going to be able to take care of it, and it is going to be your forever flute. You'd rather just buy a flute now and then just continue maintaining it for 15, 20 years, whatever. That is going to be a better option for exactly the same reasons. So step up flutes are meant to be a step up, not the end.
Yeah. So we actually do have though a list of scenarios of people who should be getting a step up flute, because they really do fill a very important need. So hypothetical player number one currently borrows or rents a student model instrument. They've been playing in school band or orchestra for like 2 to 3 years. They plan to continue with school band until high school graduation, so maybe another 3 to 5 years. And they like flute, but they're not really sure if they're going to play past high school. So this person, they're into it. They need something that's going to keep up with them because maybe they're pretty good, but they're not like, I want to be a flutist.
But they want to get an honor band. They'd like to be first chair, and enjoy the competition of it. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So more than just like someone, because there are lots of people who go through high school just on their student flutes, and that's totally
and that's totally fine.
But if you're going to be like trying out for regionals and that kind of stuff, but you're not like, this is what I want to do like forever, then that's great. Like get a little bit nicer flute, and that will allow you to do those honor bands and stuff like that. But it doesn't have to be a forever thing. Cool. Do you want to comment any more on player number one?
I think player number one's a really good candidate for one of the things we said we weren't going to do is name specific brands and models. We're not going to create a shopping list for people because we do want to keep this kind of like industry neutral so that it benefits everyone. But this would be a good candidate for somebody who may not need a solid silver head joint. They may want open holes. They may want to be foot. They may or may not want to get a splitty. They probably don't need a C sharp. So this would be one of those people that probably the lower range, that like $15 to like $2,000 range would be a good fit for them. In Canada, that is $2,500 ish. Sorry guys, the exchange is brutal up here. They would be a good candidate for like that sort of like first half pricing. I think.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense? Is anybody else got any comments on that one?
No.
Probably doesn't need a C sharp trail.
One thing for that sort of scenario is there are from time to time quality music stores that will sort of do a leasing program on these, where they'll let you make 2 or 3 months of rent, and then they'll apply that to the purchase price. That's always a consideration if you're looking at this, to see, is it worth the investment or not?
Absolutely. Yep. Great.
If you've got 5 years left to play on a step up instrument, do not expect to be able to sell it for much of anything. I think generally. So like resale on step up flutes should really not be a massive consideration once they're more than a couple years old.
Right.
So actually, that is important to kind of know too.
And this is actually something that I kind of wanted to talk about at one point anyway, which is, buying used, and maybe we can talk about that at the end, because there are certain times to buy used and certain times to not buy used. Okay, so let me add that to the end. Buying used. Okay.
Yes.
Cool. All right, let's scoot ahead because I don't want to run out of time here. Player number two currently rents or borrows a student model instrument, has been playing in band or orchestra for 2 to 3 years, and studies privately. Loves the flute, capital loves the flute, will play through high school and beyond in some way, realizes that if they will be playing long-term, they'll need to upgrade further, is looking for a flute that will grow with them while they save up for a handmade flute, and will likely use whatever they get at this point for a backup flute for their future handmade flute. So this is a flute that is probably going to be on the north end of our price range, because it's going to need to last a little bit longer and play to a little bit higher level. Anybody want to elaborate, or is that pretty clear cut?
No, I mean, that's sort of like just a genuine like application of it being a step up flute. It is helping them step up into the handmade category as a placeholder while they put their money aside.
Absolutely.
This would be a good flute to bump up your price if possible, to get a solid silver body. If you can, don't worry about necessarily bells and whistles, but this would be depending on the well, here's the clarification, because depending on the brands and stuff like that, The plating on one of the things to be aware of is the plating on step-up flutes is not the same as plating on professional flutes. So if you tend to be a little hard on plating, this would be if you need it to last for a very long time, like as a backup. That would be where you would sort of go, yeah, maybe I'll spend the extra $800 or $500.
And that's why I kind of made that face, is because I want people to understand that a Miyazawa 202 is a plated flute that is beyond this category, right? So don't go, oh, they said solid silver. No, we didn't.
No. Step up plating is significantly thinner than professional plating, and that is the only reason why I would sort of say that for some of the brands, it's sort of something you may want to consider if cosmetics matter to you. If cosmetics don't matter to you, like
so we're saying solid silver body loaded with nuance, and
yes,
it has to be. I think that would be
it's tricky. It's tricky. It's not necessarily definitely better.
So also, if you're gonna go solid silver at this price point too, odds are that it's still flash plated anyways. So I wouldn't get solid silver for the purpose of avoiding dealing with plating. Definitely some merit to avoiding plating sometimes, but this is not one of those situations where it's going to work out that way.
So I would say
well, and that's why I said it may be worth looking at. But it's a really tricky. You'll see us. We're like going, maybe it is a good idea, maybe it isn't, and that should be the message that people actually take home. Is maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Like don't get
hung up on
the
it.
whole. It has to. Don't get hung up on it. I have silver plated flutes that I love way more than solid silver flutes.
And like I said before, like it comes back to the mechanism, because you can spend, okay, well, I'm going to say this out loud because I actually have it in writing on the article that I already recommended. So
okay, go for it. Have at it.
For example, Yamaha. I love Yamaha flutes from the 200s to the 900s. Like, they are fabulous instruments.
Very consistent.
But in my humble opinion, you should not go from a Yamaha 200 to a Yamaha 400, because there is zero difference in the head joint and the mechanism, other than one has holes punched in it. So like, and you can get a solid silver head joint. Like, to me, for a Yamaha, jump to the 500 series, because then you are legit getting a better mechanism. Then
it's a whole different animal.
It's a whole different animal, right?
So for not that much more. Like,
So,
I feel like that's kind of what Kim was trying to say,
and that's where, like, but the 400 has a solid silver body and the 500 does not.
But this 400 has a commercial mechanism, and the 500 has a more hand finished mechanism.
So this is where I'm saying
I would take the takeaway from this that I would personally like people to hear is, if you're upgrading and you need it to last a long time, go with mechanism over plating.
Yes.
Go with what is mechanically going to be more durable, because the plating may be totally fine for you, or it may totally not be fine for you. But if you have a mechanism that plays amazing, like cosmetics in terms of plating should not be the top
again
jump.
Specific, like Yamaha plating, to have the Yamaha plating.
Yamaha plating,
it doesn't fail. So like, don't worry about it.
You're plating
as an easy sort of like cheat.
I shouldn't say doesn't. Rarely.
Right. One thing that can kind of help you sort of cheat this is decide what once you have established a budget, try them out, and typically you are going to favor an instrument that is a higher quality of manufacture, because it's going to perform better. It should. It's going to feel better in the hand.
Well, okay. It's immediately though, when they're brand freaking new, like, not necessarily. Like, you can't really tell. Because
not when you're 13 years old.
Right. So like, okay. So for example, Um, without naming names, I have had students of mine go in and try out Flute A, Flute B, and Flute C. And I know that from a mechanical standpoint, I hate Flute C, because I know that there are all sorts of things that can go wrong with it, right? But
But
I
they love them.
also hate Flute C because it's got a killer head joint and everybody loves the way that it sounds, right? And
Yep.
so I have had students
Darn it, Flute C.
That's fair.
go, I'm getting Flute C, and I go, oh, but how about
Oh,
B?
like, nope, it's not a good match.
Don't you love Flute B?
Every single
All that
time.
glitters is not gold.
Yeah.
Well, and actually,
And it's hard to tell because immediately when they're brand new and everything is in good adjustment, you don't notice the deficiencies in the mechanism and the pads as much. But a year later, when those pads that were installed hastily and that loose king post start to wiggle around,
fun, right?
and then I
Like it.
can't fix it because it's impossible to fix because of the way that the flute was set up. And that's when it's like, okay, well, you spent $3,000 on a flute that I can never make sound as good as when you bought it because of the way that it was manufactured.
And this is why they are stepping stones, people.
But-
They're not designed to last forever.
Right.
Like
But
the
there
reality is they're
are,
just,
but
but there are
some that you
more
can.
mechanically,
right.
yes,
And
there
so
are more mechanically stable ones, and that's a
right.
balancing act.
And this is the difficulty of this area, and where it's so important to talk to somebody knowledgeable and not to just trust your friend or your teacher who says, oh, that one sounds great, who's not
Yes.
not a mechanic, not a flute
Yeah,
mechanic.
you can trust that they evaluate the sound well. Of course, that's their
Right.
that's their line of expertise. But it's going, getting a technical opinion can be very
Yes.
invaluable.
Because you need to balance that. Yes, it sounds great now with the, well, is it going to sound great next year?
Yeah.
And that's where I have a lot of difficulty watching a lot of the conversations that happen on flute forums.
And stuff like that. Yeah.
Because it's like all of these people are chiming, oh, my student has blah 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 and it sounds great, and I'm like, yes it does, but
Well, and the other thing to keep in mind with step up flutes is that step up flutes don't always have a permanent manufacturing home. When you buy a professional flute from Boston or from Japan, if you buy a handmade flute that has been made in that factory or functionally that factory for the last 60 years or 50 years or 40 years, and it's handmade and it's always been made by the same lineage of people and it's been passed on that way, that's a very different scenario. The step up flutes, to make them the price that they are, means that they are almost exclusively made overseas, which is not a problem. That's how we get them to be in the price point. But it also means that to keep those prices down and accessible to the most people, the factories do change who is building them for them occasionally. And that's not a bad thing or a good thing. It is just the way it is. So companies do move around and stuff like that. So if you have a step up model that is made today, it may not actually be the same as a step up model that was made 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And again, that's not bad or good. It just is. So going by like references of, oh, I bought this one 10 years ago and it's been great, is a statement of that flute that was made 10 years ago in that plant with those people doing quality control.
Yep.
So that is something that you do have to kind of be a little careful with. Yeah, Rachel.
Oh, and similarly, on the same note, if sometimes folks will have a bad experience with the flute brand that was 10 years ago, and they have, especially in this price point, especially, it has grown so much with so many different models, and the processes have improved so much that there's just been a enormous improvement between, like say 2005 till now in this category. So they've come forward by leaps and bounds, almost across the board. So like if you had a bad experience with a flute 10 years ago, maybe give their new offerings a shot, because they're always working on making these better and more efficient and more consistent. So
well, and we're sort of fortunate because we get to talk to the factories all the time. And the thing that I consistently hear from all of the makers, I talk to everybody on the phone because I'm sort of separated. So I call them up because I don't have anybody local to chat with. So I call it the manufacturers, and the one thing that I consistently hear back is, we're working on improving this, we're working on improving this, we're working on improving this, we just moved this to here and we're working on improving this. So I mean, the companies are very aware of like wanting to up the quality control and up the bar. It's just a matter of how to do that. So yeah, you just kind of have to shop around with what is available when you're buying, and make decisions based on that, especially for this level, because 5 years ago is actually sort of irrelevant in a lot of cases.
I would also say at this price point, please don't make it a primary consideration where the flute was made, because that's not going to give you a good read on whether it's no problem. That is not an accurate measure.
I agree. Let's.
I get upset when people ditch that we see this on the flute forums and stuff like that online. It's like, oh, but it's made in place X. And I get kind of upset about that, because each of the companies that have those flutes made give the specs to the factories that make them. So if you were to get, it's sort of like car parts. If you were to buy car parts from the place that makes all of the car parts for Ford and Chevy and Volvo and BMW and whatever, and they're all made in the same plant, that does not make them the same car part. It means that the same plant made them, but the specs are entirely different. So the fact that it was made someplace overseas is not a good way to judge. Oh, but they also make such and such, is irrelevant. It really is.
Yep, agreed. Agreed. So we had a couple more scenarios, and we're running out of time.
I'm passionate about that part.
It's okay. So I'm actually going to combine our player 3 and our player 4, because they're similar enough. Okay.
Okay.
So this is our adult player, whether they're a beginner or a community band player, or a accomplished intermediate to advanced player, maybe a woodwind doubler, or someone who right. So an adult who's responsible, who's just looking for a dependable flute that's going to last for many years. Okay. So they're not concerned about like resale value. They don't really care about like the latest trends in like head joint cutting or scale or any of that kind of stuff. So they're willing to spend a few $1,000s on something. So this is a situation of like, maybe they could be looking at this step up / intermediate category, or they might be better off looking at something that is a used professional and vintage even, because if they can afford to overhaul it, then there are a million used like Hanes, for example, floating around out there for like $3,000. Right. So if like I said, latest scale, latest head joint cut, latest all that stuff is not a concern, or if you can play an inline flute, oh my gosh, you can get a deal and a half.
Oh yeah. Well, the other thing is used flutes where the current model has upgraded a spec tremendously. Like I got an amazing deal on my Miyazawa 202 because it is the pre-broker system. So I love it. I don't, as a technician, it's my baby anyway. So whatever. I didn't own a broker before, so it didn't matter to me. I like the price point, and I like the handmade part, and I like the light because I have a shoulder injury and a neck injury. So for me, buying a used or functionally used flute that had older specs was a really great way to get a flute that I would never have been able to necessarily just go buy a new one off the shelf. So the specs didn't,
Yep. Absolutely. So I would say things to watch out for if you're looking at something used. In general, it's not worthwhile buying a used version of a flute in this price range that we're talking about, because overhauling it, the tricky thing about these flutes is you can't quite treat them like a beginner flute from a repair standpoint if you want them to perform like an intermediate flute. So that means we have to charge accordingly. Like for an overhaul, we can't charge it like a beginner flute, but then it's like you're almost creeping into the price range of where you could buy at the bottom end of a new one. So it's just it's a financial conundrum. So if you get a good deal, you think, and you buy a used, something that retailed at like 2,500, say you get it from somebody for like 1,200 bucks. And you're like, yes, I got this $2,500 flute for 1,200 bucks. And then it needs to be overhauled to the tune of like $800. Like,
Ooh.
saved $400. Like, hey, I mean, that's significant, but
You also got a 5-year-old or 10-year-old intermediate flute that has a functional lifespan really of
right.
10 years
So,
top.
Right. So you kind of have to think about that. So that's where, if you are looking at used, maybe look at something that was more expensive to start with, get it checked out by a technician to make sure they agree that it's worth putting the work into.
Definitely.
And go from there.
Sometimes you can snag really good intermediates though from people who thought they were going to be playing longer they did. So like I do occasionally have something come up where usually the scenario is a parent thought that their child or minor in their household was going to be continuing through high school, and then something dramatically changes in their life where band is not offered in their school anymore, so they don't want to take private lessons, and they bought a new step up or intermediate less than 24 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a year old. They just played it in school because it turns out they weren't really into band as much as the parents had hoped. So those are good options to buy, but definitely get them checked out first. But sometimes you can snag a deal if you kind of look around.
Absolutely. So Rachel, you I think have the most experience out of any of us. You had mentioned advancements. And so this used to be your job, was doing quality control for a step up line of flutes, right? So what sort of advancements have happened in the last 10, 15 years in terms of step up flute technology?
Yes. So we're talking about head joints as a primary benefit of upgrading your flute. And the thing about head joints is that to cut an embouchure hole that is sophisticated and nuanced and can do all these great things that a student flute head joint is not designed to do, that typically involved a lot of handwork to have done. So you wouldn't be able, the companies would not have been able to offer that in the past on an intermediate flute. However, advancements have been made in machining so that they can produce a pretty sophisticated head joint cut all on the machine, and that brings a lot of value to this price point that was not there before. So that's definitely a technology thing. Also, mechanically, because of advancements in machine work and production techniques, you can get a more precise mechanism and still be within this price point. Whereas before, there was still a fair amount of handwork and this in the production of it, and there's just only so much that you could do before it had to just go out the door because it's an intermediate flute. So like I have two flutes here, and one was made 10 years ago and one was made 30 years ago, and they're both equivalents. They're both kind of open hole intermediate flutes with essentially a very similar mechanism designed to a student flute, kind of like what we talked about in the lower end of the range. And they were both made with the same amount of care, and both companies really wanted to do the best they could for this flute, but I would much rather have the one that's 10 years old, and just simply because of those, it's night and day playing these two, and they're both in great shape. They're both, I've tested, they're both in good adjustment. So you do notice it when you play. I hope was that too generic or?
No, that was great. That was great. It's 9 o'clock. So is there any last things that we want to, I'm sorry, it's 6 o'clock, Kim.
I feel tired suddenly.
It's on the hour o'clock. Is there anything that we want to leave people with as a parting words of wisdom? I mean, we covered a lot of ground. I think that's pretty thorough.
I think the only thing I'd like to add is if you have a flute tech, involve your flute tech in the sort of like dialogue when you're looking to buy one. And if you don't have a flute tech, this is a really good time to start shopping for one. because when you're doing that jump up, it's a really good opportunity to jump up in care and stuff like that as well. So it is worth sort of spending the effort to if you have a tech, talk to the tech, and if you don't have a tech, start even just like, so you know who, if you were to run into problems in like 6 months or a year or 2 years or 5 years, you start having those connections because you'll start needing them.
Right. Well, and especially, you know, because these flutes do need to be oiled more frequently and adjusted. Like, right, you really do need to have somebody who can.
Well, and the biggest difference for as a technician is the fact that they have the open holes, and that changes how we have to install pads and take pads out and shim pads and regulate pads. So it is a pretty big leap, and there are plenty of retail techs who do a great job at it, so not knocking the retail techs because I was one too, but it is a very different thing. It requires all different tools, so it is a good time to actually sort of look into a tech who's used to working on open hole flutes primarily, regardless of where they actually work at. Somebody who works on lots and lots of open hole flutes, because that will serve all of you better.
Absolutely. That's I think a great place to leave it.
Sure.
So, woo.
Yay.
All right.
Leave questions in the comments.
Yes, please do. Because this is, like I said, a hot topic. We get asked about it constantly. And it's we have plenty more to say. And I think maybe doing that show on the next up category.
I think that's a great idea. We should do that.
Enlightening.
Soonish.
Soonish. So, all right. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We couldn't do this if nobody was interested, so we appreciate the support. And next week we'll be back with a special guest. Adam, do you want to tell us about our special guest next week?
Yeah, so
awesome.
Our special guest, so we do a lot of like maker highlights and showcases throughout the month, and this month's maker is Haynes. So next week we will be having Joy Roberts, who's head of quality control at Haynes, and then we will also, I believe we're also going to be having Avon O'Leary, who is the head joint cutter, and I think she's also general manager.
Yeah,
so I'm very excited to have them on next week.
Fun. Yeah, that's going to be a fun show. So please join us next week for that. So we'll see you all then. Thanks for watching. See you
Bye.
guys. Bye.
Bye.